good morning.
Hi, Nancy.
Thank you so much for joining us this morning.
You are my
Give us a
friend.
couple of minutes and we'll get started while we wait for a couple more people to join us. But thank you so much for joining us this morning. All right, well, thank you again for joining us this morning for this tour with the Timken Gallery. We're so excited to have everyone with us this morning. Just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. Please keep yourselves muted throughout the presentation. If you do have any questions, please go ahead and use the chat function through Zoom. And go ahead and drop your question there, and we'd be happy to answer those at the end of today's presentation. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, welcome to you as well. You can do the same. If you do have any questions, you can use the comment section there, and we'll be monitoring that, and we'll be happy to answer those questions at the end as well. Lastly, this is being recorded and streamed, as I mentioned. And so if you would like to go back and watch this tour or any previous tours put on by the Timken, you can find those on our social media, so our YouTube channel, as well as our Facebook page. So again, without further ado, I'm so excited to be presenting this lecture today. We have our lovely docent, Karen, who's going to be presenting on French painting in the 17th century. So I'll go ahead and turn that over to her.
Thank you so much, Samantha. As I always say, we're so blessed to have Samantha, who is a graduate student at UC Davis and actually does part-time lecturing there as well. So the Timken is very blessed to have her working with us. And also, just another quick comment I'd like to make is please feel free to ask questions at the end. We always leave a few minutes, and the questions are really interesting to us and to me personally. And so please don't be shy if you have a question. No question will be uninteresting. So let's begin with the French Baroque. And the Baroque, of course, is basically in the 17th century. You know, in our previous lectures, my lecture last month on Spanish Baroque, it was a very religious, dramatic, counter-Reformation type of art, and often sponsored by the Catholic Church. And then, of course, the Habsburgs. But the French Baroque is quite different. And I also want to make a little bit of a comparison to the Dutch Baroque, for example, the Dutch 17th century art, because Holland was a Protestant nation, and it was a middle-class nation, it was a wealthy nation. So you saw less use of overtly religious subject matter, and it was more landscape, still life, portraiture. But in France, it's really unique because France really takes the lead on landscapes which incorporate other subject matter, mythological, religious, and historical. But the landscape becomes a real focus, particularly when we look at Claude Lorrain, which we will in just a few minutes. The restraint of the French Baroque is quite different than what you see, for example, with the Flemish, like Peter Paul Rubens, for example, which is often dramatic on the diagonal. The lion hunt that he does of, you know, snarling lions, or the slashing, the dramatic, or the infused light of the Italian painter Caravaggio, who you can see in this George de la Tour. So French Baroque is restrained, it's classical, it's based on Greco-Roman antiquity, it uses a strong observation of landscape, and it's very connected to what is also happening in Holland and in Italy. So we're going to begin right now. Oh, and before I forget, it's really important to note that during the French Baroque, we have two rulers basically in charge. The first is Louis XIII, whose mother was Marie Medici, whose father was Henry IV. And he becomes the Dauphin, the ruler, at age 9 in the early part of the 17th century. So many works were commissioned by the court of Louis XIII, who was really monitored by Cardinal Richelieu, a statesman and religious figure. And then later, about mid 17th century, we have the reign of Louis XIV, Louis XIV, and he was the one who developed Versailles, and he also has been the longest ruler of any king or queen in all of Western history. Okay, so Et in Arcadia Ego. And this is by Nicolas Poussin. And Poussin was kind of Roman by adoption because he spent a lot of time in Italy. He trained with Simone Lui, who you're going to see. He loved the work of Raphael and the Venetian painter Titian. He lived, as I said, in Italy, but then he was kind of welcomed back by the King Louis XIII, Louis XIII, to decorate his palaces, Luxembourg Palace, for example. And he was also, he was born in Fontainebleau, so I believe he did some paintings there. He actually had, Louis XIII had 31 of Poussin's paintings because he loved him so much. Okay, let's really talk about Poussin specifically. He was fascinated with antiquity. He loved to study the Greeks and the Romans, and not only the art, but the writings. And he incorporates this immense study of landscape painting. Now, landscape painting exists in on the island of Crete in antiquity. They painted the Minoan palaces. I've actually seen them. But really, landscape painting begins to emerge in Europe about the 15th century. We talked about this a couple months ago. But it's really the 17th century where we see such a focus on landscape. But of course, as you can see, there's a subject that is also about antiquity. So let's talk about the meaning. Et Arcadia Ego means even in Arcadia, I am there. So this is a very very metaphorical painting. Why? Well, let's talk a little bit about it. These three shepherds, here we are, we have three shepherds, and they're pointing to the writing on this coffin. And it is the writing Et Arcadia Ego. In Arcadia, we are there. And what is Arcadia? Arcadia, as I've mentioned before, is in Greece. And in reality, it's an area that's kind of rocky and desolate. But it changed form. And in Greek mythology, it became this land of beauty and peace and nature. So that's the reference to Arcadia. But what this painting is actually talking about is sort of like Shakespeare's 18th sonnet, where beauty will fade and life ends, but art and writing will withstand. And that is what Poussin is trying to say, that we all face death. You know, we have a tomb here, and we have truth, who witnesses this. She's truth. She looks like a Roman goddess, doesn't she? A Roman sculpture. She's in a contrapposal pose, and she has this gold and blue robes, the red. These primary colors also relate to the idea of truth. And she is a witness to this idea that this is death, but art immortalizes life. And so we need to face this memento mori, this momentum of death, but then art keeps it alive. And then also he concentrates on this exquisite classical landscape. A lot of blues and the muted colors are seen in French Baroque, unlike some of the, for example, the Italian Baroque or the Flemish Baroque or the Spanish Baroque, where in the Spanish Baroque it's very, as you saw last month, if you attended the lecture, very dark and stark, a lot of tenebrism and chiaroscuro. But here we have a more modulated light. It's not so direct. It isn't, this is a classical formation of the three forms here. And this is the second version of the same painting that he did, because this is the Louvre painting, but he also did one that is in England today. Okay, so I'm going to move on. And I'm going to show you another Poussin landscape with St. John on Patmos. Now, Patmos was a Greek island that was known to be kind of a haven for Christian believers, Christian martyrs. And St. John, who wrote the book of Revelations, is shown in the pose of almost like a Greek man, like a Greek philosopher. And you can see that there is, again, this incorporation of these exquisite classical ruins, Greek ruins. We have it looks like a Doric temple here, an obelisk, and some portions of a temple here. And then, of course, this exquisite, beautiful water and these highly detailed trees. So again, he loved to study nature. He was very a Stoic himself. He kind of believed in Stoicism. That's Poussin. He wasn't interested in, even though he did well financially because the king paid for a lot of his paintings, he really believed in a simple life. And that's kind of what is brought out in here as St. John. Now, another point of this painting that you might have missed is the eagle here. And that is one of the attributes. And an attribute, of course, is something that is put in a painting to give you more information about the subject. And this was his, St. John had the eagle as a companion. And what does the eagle represent? Well, the king of the birds and this ability to just fly high and look at the sun. And so it kind of relates to spirituality as well. So here we have St. John, who is writing the book of Revelations on this beautiful remote island of Patmos in the guise of actually a Greek scholar or philosopher. However, the thing that kind of makes it interesting too is that you have a halo here. So that indicates one of the apostles of Christ, and that, of course, he was one of the closest, like Peter, one of the closest to Jesus. So there was a religious aspect to it, but in this painting and the work of Poussin, you don't see this interest in the Counter-Reformation that you would see, for example, in Philippe de Champagne, who we're going to look at in just a minute. This is not a Counter-Reformation type Catholic painting. It is more subtle. Now, let's look at this landscape with Diogenes. And Diogenes was a Greek philosopher. And again, I told you that Poussin, who was really, and I should mention this, probably the greatest landscape painter of France of the 17th century. And many people say even one of the greatest landscape painters of all the 17th century when you look at the work of the Dutch, Van Ruysdael, and others. But he was a tremendous landscape painter, and his use of light and classicism, it's so remarkable. Now, if you notice, this palette is quite different than the previous one. It's more subdued, lots of greens and yellows, a little more monochromatic. This is probably the least copied of any of Poussin's paintings, where many of them were copied. This one, not so much. It's more difficult. It's very detailed. Look at all the details. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the subject in just a second. So look at the attention to detail. He really studied landscapes, the areas. He had lived in Rome and saw so much of the Roman countryside. And he incorporates some of this in this kind of composite landscape. Composite meaning it's not one specific place, it's more idealized. So who is Diogenes? Diogenes was a Greek philosopher, and he really proposed that poverty and was very important, that we didn't need all the accoutrements of society. And as I pointed out, Poussin was kind of like that too. I mean, he did make a lot of money eventually in his life, but he never lived an ornate, ostentatious life, even though he was connected to the court of Louis XIII. So Diogenes believed, the Greek philosopher, that giving up one's earthly possessions was really important. And he did that. However, if you look here, he has given up all his earthly possessions to wander the globe, but he still has his staff, which he needs, but he has a drinking vessel here. Well, he decides, after seeing this man who also was wandering the earth, drinking from this water source, and he just cups his hands, that a drinking vessel is not really necessary. So Diogenes begins to travel the world without even needing that. And then we have, of course, some other figures here. So we have this foreground with the waterway and the figures, this middle ground with all the trees and the figures, and then this exquisite, these ruins, or maybe not even ruins. I believe that they're just, the buildings of probably Renaissance buildings. So again, we have probably the greatest 17th century landscape painter in the work of Nicolas Poussin. Now, we're going to look at a work of a completely different artist, Philippe de Champagne. He was a very interesting person. He was Belgian by birth, and he actually studied the work of Peter Paul Rubens. I believe he was in direct contact with Rubens. He worked for Maria Medici, who was the mother of Louis XIII. He often painted Cardinal Richelieu, who worked with Louis XIII, and Richelieu really didn't let anybody paint him except de Champagne. De Champagne was considered, as Poussin was a great landscape painter of the French Baroque, de Champagne was a great portrait painter. However, he became, in 1640, a Jansenist, and the Jansenists were really extreme Catholic individuals. In fact, so much so that even the Catholic Church was not too happy with them. But he did sort of propaganda type paintings for the church in the Counter-Reformation, in the idea that the Catholic Church should prevail and the Protestant sects like Calvinism should be subdued. And that happens to be a problem in France during this time because we had the 30 Years' War that ends about 1648, I believe, and a lot of it was social upheaval and religious upheaval. And so that is kind of going on as these paintings are being done. Now, just one more point. Why did de Champagne become a Jansenist, this extreme sort of cult of Catholicism? It's because his daughter, who actually was in she was in a convent, developed a terrible illness, and she was rendered paraplegic. She was paralyzed. And with deep prayer and Catholic intervention, she actually was healed. And he believed his strong Catholic faith helped that. So he really became involved with Catholic subject matter. So what do we have here? We have Christ healing the blind, and it is a parable, and we also have Christian parable, and we also have the city of Jericho, of course, religious in nature, and we have all these disciples and followers of Christ watching as Christ, this figure here in red and blue, is extending his hand to help these blind men in this grotto. And so his healing powers are brought to the test right here. And all the followers are in amazement as he begins to heal these people. Now you can see, not so much here, but his ability to create figurative elements is remarkable. And we'll look at that in just a second. But also look at how carefully he creates this very almost aerial perspective. We're looking at this rugged promontory, and we have like a medieval castle or fortress up here. We have this exquisite wall, Jericho. It's just exquisite. We see all kinds of sort of ruins here, and this ruined gateway. We have shepherds in the field. We have these exquisitely designed trees. But again, you see this pervasive palette of pale blues. You don't see that deep resonance of red and darkness that you see in other Baroque painters. All right, so this is a Counter-Reformation painting done by Philippe de Champagne, who worked for the court of Louis XIII. He also really captures a psychological nuances of the figures, and you're going to see that in just a second. All right, and here we go, Louis XIII, crowned by victory. Now, Louis XIII, there was an Edict of Nantes, and the Edict of Nantes was that the Huguenots would be protected, but didn't go very well, and eventually their rights were taken away. And there was a little battle, and actually Louis came out ahead, and he was celebrating this victory of sort of suppressing the Calvinist Huguenots in this one region of France. So it's a victory. And so we have Victory, who is modeled after the Nike of Samothrace, and she hovers over the king and puts the laurel crown. So it's kind of mixing the metaphors of angels and Nike. They're mixing the metaphors of a laurel crown, which is from Greek mythology. You see his helmet, and you see he's very proud. You can see he really, de Champagne really captures his physical presence. He's in this amazingly elaborate suit of decorative armor. We have these leather boots. We have the embellishments here, his lace crown, the silk banner, and this face looks directly at us. He's very secure in his accomplishments, and he wants to celebrate that. And also, as I mentioned, de Champagne was the favored portrait painter of Louis XIII's reign, and of course, Richelieu. So the other thing I wanted to point out is he was also influenced by Peter Paul Rubens because, as I said, he studied with him. So we do get a little more of the Rubenesque style here because Rubens also was a great portrait painter. And we have this on the this sort of diagonal, which is very Dutch, pardon me, Flemish Baroque, this diagonal composition. But we also have, again, this kind of hearkening to Dutch and French Baroque. Now, they also studied the Dutch. It is not to say that they eliminated that, but the Flemish Baroque were really kind of influential. All right. This is really one of my favorites in the whole talk because, as you probably know, I'm really interested in still life painting. In fact, my next lecture will be next week on Thursday on still life painting at the Timken and other museums. But let's talk about this Vanitas. There's two words in art history, memento mori and vanitas. Now they're not exactly they're not exactly, well, let's say that synonymous. They're not exactly synonymous, but they do have a reference. Okay, so vanitas really is the genre of painting, these vanitas that bring out memento moris, which are mementos of death. So that's how they kind of overlap. And this is a very unusual painting in that it's lined up 1, 2, 3, and it's on a very hard surface. And it's like a stone slab, and it's very detailed here with the little cracks. And then we have 3 memento mori. What are they? Well, of course, the skull we're facing our mortality. And if you look at this skull, it looks directly at us. It's like a mirror to our souls. So of course, in the 17th century, particularly with the Dutch and Flemish, they were always looking at the ephemeral nature of life, whether it's in a landscape and clouds overtaking a sunny day, or these figures that show the passage of time. So of course we have the hourglass, and time is drifting. And then we have a flower. And you might say, well, how is this a memento mori? But as I mentioned in past lectures, flowers represent the cycle of life. You have this beautiful bud, this tulip that were so popular in Holland. But eventually the petals will open and then the whole flower will fade. And so again, it is a reminder of the passing of time. And it's in this exquisite glass vase. You can see his ability to paint light. We have some reflections here, and we have reflections with the shadows. Now, this very stark background is kind of reminiscent of the Spanish Baroque, but I will tell you, we don't have that quite that Caravaggio-esque lighting that you will see a little bit later on with George de la Tour. So this is a Vanitas, still life done just a few years before his death. And it is a reminder of our mortality.
Do you allow any questions or not?
Oh, if you had a quick question, sure, go ahead.
On that last one, how large is that?
Let me just go back to it. Hold on. Sorry, I just lost just one moment. Okay, yes, go ahead. What's the question?
How large is that?
You know, that's a really good question. I believe it's a moderate size. This is not a large painting. Most still lifes, well, that isn't really true because the Flemish did really large still lifes, but it's not so much with the Dutch and the French. So this is probably more moderate size painting, but quite remarkable, don't you think?
I agree.
Yeah, I love it. So let's move on to, again, more of a Counter-Reformation type of painting. I mean, it isn't the Counter-Reformation total propaganda, but there is an element of let's support the Catholic Church, let's support his very overt religiosity. So the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to the Virgin Mary and tells her that she will conceive of the Christ child. And he painted this over and over and over again, and as did many artists during this time period and earlier. And it was done when he was a relatively a young man. Oh, he was 40 maybe. And you see these angels hovering, watching this spiritual revelation. And we have some interesting details. We have this beautiful book and sort of tabletop, and you see her face. Now, he was, as I mentioned, he was such a great portrait painter, and she's just so beautiful. And maybe even one of his family members were used for this particular painting because she's very real looking, and she is wearing the robes of red and blue, as she often does, almost always. We have the archangels, very detailed. And the light, again, it's different from this Caravaggio-esque light. It's more of a spiritual light. And you can see the clouds and the heavens opening up, and it pours down on them, and it lights this whole very vertical painting. So again, we were seeing that he kind of is pledging his interest in the Counter-Reformation. You can see that he is a brilliant painter, particularly of figurative elements, and that he's a deeply spiritual and religious man. Now, we're going to move on to the work of Claude Lorrain, and this is in our very own Timken landscape. And this is just a remarkable painting because, in a sense, this is landscape for landscape's sake. So there isn't really a historical reference. There's really not much of a mythological or religious. It doesn't really exist in this painting. Laurent was very interested in classical idealization of beauty. He loved harmony and sensitivity. He's really kind of opens up the beginning of neoclassicism in French art. And that's a point I just want to make really quickly. Most of the paintings we're looking at, not all of them, but many of them are painted during the first half of the 17th century. When we go into the latter half of the 17th century, and even at this time too, we begin to see a more classical manner of painting. And remember, it was the French who developed in the latter part of the 17th century and early in the 18th century with Jacques Louis David, for example, and Ingres, and some of these others, that they began to go toward more classical subject matter and style. And again, you see, he too was this brilliant landscape painter. He loved to study light and the effects on time of day. He also worked a great deal in Italy. So all of these artists basically had some connection with Italy. And what do we have here? Again, we have almost this Arcadian idea, this exquisite composite landscape. It is not a specific place. It is more in his studies. He studied in Italy, he took notes, and he would lie on his back, as I mentioned, and just look at the light. So what do we have here? In the foreground, we have a shepherd who is getting his feet bathed by these two women, very kindly. And then we have these individuals with cow and goat and dog crossing a quiet river. And then up here in the middle right area, we have an exquisite waterfall, just water cascading, and some ruins. And of course, you know, the Campagna, for example, which we're going to look at in just a second, there were so many ruins, Greco-Roman ruins, that it was really inspirational. And again, here we have a fortress on a promontory, some more buildings, and they look either medieval, these look more like ruins, these look more like established. And then of course this exquisite sky, because he also looked at some of the Dutch artists. You can see that with kind of this lower horizon line. So these Baroque artists are very inspired each other quite a bit. And then of course, just like Poussin and de Champagne, they really studied the individual aspects of these trees and bushes. And again, you have this exquisite light. It is not the light of tenebrism that's stark white and black. It's not so pervasive and dramatic as we see as Caravaggio, but of course, it's more Dutch in its characteristics. So this is a beautiful landscape that is not religious. It's not historical necessarily, and it's not really mythological. It's kind of landscape for landscape's sake. So as I said a little bit earlier, it was really the Dutch and the French who began to create landscape for the beauty of landscape. Part of the reason for this is that France in the 16th century was becoming urbanized. You know, people were moving out from the city and going into the countryside. So there's a lot of changes in the countryside, and they want to begin to depict that. Also, a lot is going on historically. As I mentioned, the 30 Years' War. We have a lot of political and religious and social upheaval in France. You know, we still have plagues going on. So, you know, this is an attempt maybe to have a place of quietude, to just look and observe. Now, here's a Rome at the Campagna. This is another painting. And as I mentioned, Laurent, who actually, this is interesting enough, he was really a pastry chef. And then he went to Italy. He was a poor youth, and he trained as a pastry chef, but he went to Italy, and he really got caught up with landscape painting and the Italian painters. And so he really knew Italy well. And Rome from the Campagna, this is a region outside of Tivoli, and it's really just has many beautiful ruins of antiquity, and the countryside is just exquisite and dense with vegetation and buildings. So you have what looks like a Roman temple and or Greek, and then we have these beautiful ruins here, and also now this is interesting. You can barely see it, but St. Peter's Basilica in reality is actually in this area on the left, and also the Temple of Cybele. The Greek Temple of Cybele is on the left, but he took it out. So these artists definitely use what's called artistic license to edit and enhance. And so, of course, we also have these figurative elements in repose, and they use them to show scale. So in actuality, and not taking away in any way of Laurent's ability to paint, but in a way they're a little outsized. If you notice, and you know, in comparison to this, if we look diagonally up here, they're a little outsized, meaning you would expect the figures to be a little bit smaller, as you see here. There's an animal, and then of course here, here's directly along this line is a windmill, a water, not a windmill, sorry, a water wheel, and it's much smaller in scale. So the scale, perhaps is just a little bit different. We're going to move on just for sake of time, and one more painting we're going to look at with Claude Lorrain is the landscape of Aeneas at Delos. I just want to give you a little personal anecdote on Delos. I was really lucky to visit Delos. Delos is an island in the Aegean, and I was taking my second trip to the Greek islands. Actually, I went with my whole family, and we were on a little boat, and they took us on a littler boat to Delos. You have to get on with a very small boat. And they only let a handful of people, maybe 24 people on at a time. And Delos is completely empty of people. There is no t-shirt shops. It's a beautiful museum island. And I say museum island because the ruins are just remarkable, just beautiful amphitheaters and parts of libraries. Of course, it's ruined, so you don't see complete structures, but it's filled with the ruins of antiquity, and it is a magical place. It was one of the most profound experiences of art I've ever had. And the reason why it's so important, Delos was said by the Greeks to be the birthplace of Diana and Apollo. Apollo and Diana were twins. And so it is, it doesn't quite look like this, but it is an island of ruins without commercialism. Amazing. And what this story tells us is that Aeneas, who's here, was an important figure in the Trojan Wars. And then here's the king here. And he, Laurent, even though he wasn't highly educated, he was, I think I told you he was a pastry chef. He did study the works of Virgil and Homer and, you know, the Iliad and the Odyssey. He was really steeped in Greek and Roman mythology. So he's telling a story about how the king is pointing to these trees, and the boughs of these trees helped with the birth of Diana and Apollo. So he's kind of telling a story about his birth. And then we see up here a bas relief here and at the top of the pediment, and it tells a story of some of the exploits of Diana and Apollo. And then we see this beautiful temple modeled after the Pantheon in Rome. So we have this cupola, and then we have, looks like Corinthian capitals, and we have this whole Greek pediment structure. And then of course we have other ruins here. These are Doric capitals, and we have this exquisite waterway. So you do arrive at the island of Delos on this waterway, but you don't have quite the extensive ruins that we see here. So this shows, again, Laurent's interest in Greco-Roman mythology, the writings of the Greek philosophers, and storytelling too. Again, because of time, I'm going to just have to move on. Now, let's talk a little bit about Georges de la Tour. Georges de la Tour worked with Claude Lorrain, so he studied with him. He painted mostly religious figures. He painted by candlelight at night, which is really unusual. He was definitely influenced by Caravaggio. You can see that in his work. And he looked at some of the Dutch artists as well, Hothenhorst for one, thinking about one of them. And you can really see this Caravaggio-esque light as it falls on the Mary Magdalene. And the difference is, though, his figures were more simplistic than Caravaggio, but the light source is very similar. And also his ability to capture a figurative religious subject matter. Now, as I mentioned, he almost always did nighttime paintings, and he always uses some form of candlelight. So here we have the story of Mary Magdalene, and she was a witness to the death of Jesus in Golgotha, if I said that right, Golgotha. And she was a repentant sinner, as they say. So this painting talks about repentance. You see this exquisite light that falls on her. She was considered a beautiful woman and a repentant woman. And she holds the skull that reminds us of Christ's death and also our humanity. We see this horrible little torture element that was used to torture Jesus. So there is this is like a cat o' nine tails. And then we have these books of history. And so he was, again, very influenced by the Dutch, influenced by religious figures, but he also painted sometimes, Georges de la Tour was also kind of interested in everyday people. And so we're going to look in a second at some of those paintings as well. Now, this is, pardon me, this is talking about the Ace of Diamonds and these card sharks. So not only did he observe people of his time, but sometimes he made some very sardonic or mocking commentary. So what do we have here? So we have these four figures, and if you look at it, the development of the physical features, not so developed, not as quite as skillful as the painting we looked at just before, or let's say even the work of 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲. But we have this kind of ovid form here. We have this very well-dressed, affluent young man, and he's got all the trappings of wealth, this elaborate, feather and these detailed clothes. You can even see the maybe jewelry at his wrists, and everything is so detailed. But he doesn't have the look of a very highly intelligent person because he's being cheated. And you can see this card chart giving us that, again, that sardonic look, like, this guy isn't really on the qui vive. He's not really on the up and up. He doesn't really know what's happening, but I'm actually stealing the Ace of Diamonds from him. Now, what does the Ace of Diamonds represent? The Ace of Diamonds represents kind of an epiphany that we might have, that something will open up to us, something will be revealed. So it has in card parlance, it does have kind of a special meaning. And also in card playing too, it has a very important, if you have four aces, that's pretty significant. I don't know much about cards, but that I know. And also he's commenting a little bit about a bit of debauchery here with the wine, and maybe these figures are not as aware as they could be. Look at, again, this elaborate costume of these two women. We know that these women are probably in on the little scam. Again, she is beautifully dressed with these elaborate pearls. Again, the bling of that time period, and elaborate pearls here at the headdress. and these costumes. So we don't know if she's also an aristocratic woman. She's already made quite a bit of money here, and this is about to go to him because, again, as you see, he's stolen the cars. And this young woman, we know, is aware of everything. And also the format's kind of unusual because it's very horizontal. Okay, moving on. Now, I mentioned that Georges de la Tour is often more of a religious painter. And this is a Sebastian tended by Saint Irene. Saint Sebastian was martyred. He was martyred for his Christian beliefs by being shot multiple times with arrows. Who did Georges de la Tour represent in terms of his sainthood? He was a saint of plague. And as I mentioned earlier, the plague was still going on in Europe. I mean, everybody thinks, oh, it ended at the, 14th century or the 15th century, or no, it constantly kept coming back. And ironically and sadly, we're seeing that in our own time. But anyway, so again, we have this magnificent light, the light of chiaroscuro, very influenced by Caravaggio. We have several really interesting figures. So Saint Irene is nursing him. She is gently pulling the arrows out of his body. She holds the candlelight. It's done at night. We have these weeping figures. And then we have this really beautiful, mysterious figure in a blue cowl. And this looks like it's taken right from a Burgundian tomb. It's really exquisite, very sculptural, very three-dimensional, very well modeled. Again, I keep mentioning the influence of Caravaggio, but also the influence of Rubens as well. This ability to create drama and light, very theatrical. Now, as I mentioned earlier, with the work of our landscape painters, Poussin, de Champagne, and Laurent, we have more of a subdued classical restraint form of the Baroque. De la Tour is more Italian in his, slightly more Italian, and you can see that, more dramatic. He did work with Claude Lorrain though, so he was influenced by him, but he also, again, followed some of the Dutch artists. Now, Jacques Cartier was, I'm going to do something I rarely do, but I just thought it'd be kind of interesting. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about etchings and drawings. And so Jacques Cartier, I just thought it was interesting to just put in a few of these artists. Now, he was considered the finest Baroque draftsman and printmaker in France. He was the first in all of Europe, really, to document the horrors of war. And of course, he's a predecessor to Francisco Goya. So the miseries of war were pretty gruesome. He shows us multiple hangings. Now, what is happening? What are we talking about the wars? Because there were so many wars going on, particularly I said that this is the time of the 30 Years' War, and it was a political, economic, power grab. It was quite horrendous. Parts of France were annexed. Even in this area where he lived, he saw lots and lots of death and destruction, hanging, people dying in the streets. We have sort of tents where the soldiers would be. We see, and also this fight from the Huguenots versus the Catholics. So that was also a real problem. So this is how war affects everyone. It's highly detailed. Something we should note about him is that he developed some things with etching that are still used today. It's an implement that can create deeper resonance in the etchings, and also a chemical component that coated the plates to allow the etchings not to fade or get damaged. So not only was he very progressive in his technological skills, but also his detailing of the horrors of war. He did something like 12 in this series. I also want, this might seem oxymoronic when I point this out, cartoon horrors of war, but he also helped develop the idea of cartooning in France, and cartooning not so much for funny cartoons, but also these kind of progressive narratives. Now, because of time, again, I tend to run out of time a little bit, but I want to move on just a second. Now, Caillaux was also, this was an early work by him, he was also very interested in stage design and the theater and pageantry and people and observation of people. So you can see that the large hunt is established as almost like a set design. You don't see the proscenium arch or anything like that, but you see multiple perspectives. Now, when we look at traditional painting or etchings or drawings, we often think about foreground. These are three principles of art: foreground, middle ground, background. And we talk about that a lot, and I talk about that and others. But this is really remarkable because in a sense, he captures 5 grounds. And what do I mean by that? So we have a very detailed foreground, these kind of the earth and the shadowing of the trees and the roots. And then we go to a sort of a secondary foreground where the dogs and the hunters are beginning to parade off into the middle ground. And then here again, we have this middle ground that's highly detailed, multiple figures, horses, men, dogs. And that is sort of a twofold middle ground. And then we go into this background, this promontory, again with ruins. This is kind of a ubiquitous but element in these French landscapes. And then we have, of course, these trees, and that creates a very detailed background. So this is an etching using an etching needle into a metal plate, and then it creates a multiple. So most of the art that I tend to talk about is with regard to painting, but I did want to show you a little example of how etchings and printmaking was really important at this time. And he was, of course, one of the greatest proponents of this. So he really chronicled war. He studied printmaking in France and Italy, and he also worked for the Medici court. And as I talked about a little bit earlier, I just want to reiterate, again, it's the court that really supports a lot of these artists. Many of them just said, for example, Claude Lorrain, I don't want to work for the church. I would rather work for the aristocracy, the upper bourgeois. I will have more control. However, like I mentioned, 𝗔𝗥𝗧𝗦𝗥𝗲, he did paint for Louis XIII, for example. Cardinal Richelieu. So they were very involved with the courts of both Louis XIII and Louis XIV. Okay, we just have a couple more pieces. Now, this is Ambroise Voss, and he studied with Jacques Cartier, and he was interesting because he was actually a Huguenot. So let's talk about the suffering of the Huguenots. Under Henry IV, the king, first Bourbon king, who was the father of Louis XIII, in the very end of the 16th century, Henry IV allowed with the Edict of Nantes, N-A-T-E-S, that the Huguenot Protestants who lived basically in one region would be spared, would be left alone, would be allowed to practice. But that really stops with Louis XIII. So there was a lot of difficulty with the Huguenots and the Catholics. And they actually were subdued and controlled eventually. So they didn't have a really easy situation. But Voss was a Huguenot. And like his teacher Caillaux, he really is influenced by this salon style. He loved interiors. He loved the way to look at, sort of like the Dutch, so the interiors of homes. He liked the idea of the painting of the aristocracy. His father was a tailor. So you see this hyper interest in clothing and details of the clothing. And they're kind of more subdued, not subdued, but more, they're detailed, but they don't carry a dense weight. It's more of the importance of artists, because this is a painter, the tools of the artist, the people who would be assisting him, the type of work he would be doing, how they would hang. and of course, the style of the day. I'm going to go on because, again, timing is of the essence. And okay, so the foolish virgins conversing. Really quickly, this is actually a religious subject. There was a story of the 10 virgins who were to be there as the witness of sort of the marriage of Jesus. And it was said that they needed to be in preparation to witness this. And so there were 5 very serious virgins, and there were 5 very foolish ones. And these are the foolish ones. And instead of preparing, so the marriage of Jesus symbolically refers to actually our witnessing life and the end of life and being prepared for eternity and things like that. And these girls, these 5, instead of being prepared and getting the oil in the lamp to witness, they're reading and they're playing cards, and they're just enjoying themselves in this beautiful mansion, but they're not prepared. And so they end up being locked out of the ceremony, and they end up really not being able to observe things properly. So it really is a metaphorical, it's an etching, it's a metaphorical reference to preparation and shirking one's responsibility. So we have this, again, this mantle, elaborate mantle, and with etching, a very sharp etching implement that Caillot, his teacher, developed. You can see how they can capture all this nuance. And this is put on a metal plate and then printed. So you can see that they've really developed this art form. Now, we just have a couple more paintings, and we only have about 5 minutes, so I do want to go on. Lucknow was basically an illustrator, meaning he didn't really do paintings, he did drawings. And this portrait of an old man was really remarkable in that he studies the physiognomy of people, and meaning the facial characteristics. And he really was interested in people with kind of unusual or extreme facial characteristics. And you can see that this old man, kind of as we age, I can tell you for sure, we tend to have our characteristics kind of, we change. And you can see the nose is quite developed here. He's very serious, lots of the wrinkles, and but he captures them quite adroitly. And he uses a lot of the uses of reds and maybe even a little yellow, if we can see that. But most of his drawings were done in black and white drawings. Now, because of the date, you would not have seen the work of Rembrandt, but you can definitely see how this is kind of similar to how Rembrandt could capture the psychological nature of his subjects. So again, we're going to have to move on. Now, Simone Lui was a really important painter, and Lui captures Artemise Gentileschi. And Gentileschi, I was speaking to Samantha about this. She's been doing some research on this topic. She was a poor girl. Her father was a painter. She worked in Italy, and she studied with Caravaggio. And she was one of the greatest painters of the 17th century. And it's only now that we're starting to explore these women. And Vouet knew her, and he also studied the work of Caravaggio, and he painted her as an artist, this important artist, and this beautiful capturing of her with this exquisite light that falls. And the story goes that she did study, her father was an artist, he got her commissioned to work with Caravaggio, but she also was in the study of this other artist who was horrible. This other artist, whose name escapes me, but he was actually a sexual predator. And when she was working with him, he raped her. And this is a true story. And it went to trial, and her honor was besmirched, even though she was just a young girl. I think she was 18. And so they said they were going to arrest this guy, but he escaped, went to another town. And thankfully, she was put in, was able to sort of allow her reputation not to be besmirched by marrying a lower noble, and then she escaped to Florence. So Vouet was very, I would say, thinking ahead when he painted her. He was an amazing portrait painter, and I'm just gonna, he studied during and rose to prominence during this reign of Louis the XIII, and he also work for Cardinal Richelieu. So I only have a couple more paintings and I have maybe 1 more minute, so I'm just gonna go on. Saint Cecilia, the patron saint of music. She was martyred and for her Christian beliefs. And so she was beheaded actually, but she had heard music of rapture, of her spirituality. And so she became, even though she wasn't a musician, Cecilia becomes the patron saint of music. And you can see these two little putti watching, the light falls on this musical instrument. Her face is in rapture. She's in exquisite gowns, a very beautiful tapestry-like dress. Now, because we're at the end, I just wanted to get in one more still life. No, I'm going to move on. I'm sorry, because I think it's important to talk about, Jacques Linao, this basket of flowers, really shows how the Flemish, like Jean Bruegel, was really influential in this work. I mean, the Bruegels, Jean Bruegel really helped develop this French style of of still life painting. And you can see this open woven basket, that's kind of unique. And you can see the butterfly of rebirth, and you can see all these different flowers. Now you see kind of a diffuse palette here. It's not as intense as the Dutch and Flemish, but we see all manner of flower. And one thing the French did, just as the Dutch, they often put flowers together in a composite image that really wouldn't have been growing at the same time. So tulips don't necessarily grow at the same time as carnations, but it just shows this plethora of beauty and flowers. And again, this, it's a memento mori, the ephemeral nature of life. And then my last painting I'm going to go to, and Leonard does, as we saw with Philippe de Champagne, another Vanitas painting with this very direct memento mori. And again, we're facing our mortality. It's recorded in this book of history. And again, this flower. And it's, rather than having a really harsh cement-like configuration, what we have is it's more diffused, it's a little bit softer, it's not as harsh, but it definitely represents our mortality. And in the 17th century, we still had plague, we still had people dying young, but it's not that everybody died young. A lot of people think, oh, everybody died at 31 or lived till 40, which is amazing. It isn't quite true. The high level of mortality, yes, plague and disease and lack of inoculation and contaminated water, of course, that all affected life, but it was mostly because of infant mortality. So that's why we have this level of, people died very young. They did at times, some and some not. Some of these artists, de Champagne lived well into his 70s. And as I mentioned, Louis XIV, I think he lived into his 80s, and he was one of the longest living rulers. So it wasn't that these people always died young, but again, of course, we have this infant mortality. Just really quickly on before we wrap it up, I love the way the light, the reflections on the water. This is very typical of Dutch, French, and Flemish, the reflection on the water, and we can even see it here as it breaks up the stem. And then this carnation that is kind of fading. And then the skull, again, in this very diffused configuration with the leather straps. And then again, it's almost tilted. You can feel that it's almost tilted. But one thing that French seem to do, and we'll look at this in just here for a second, they seem to put the forms very front and center. The Dutch and Flemish tended to push back and put the elements in the foreground, as not so much in the foreground, but having a more distance established. Now, Samantha will be coming in just a second, and there she is. So we'll go back to our last painting.
Thank you so much, Karen. What a fantastic presentation. Like a virtual round of applause, as we were talking about this earlier, but it's such a diverse, kind of time period. There's so many, different types of things going on. And so